Dr. Levi Roach, you are head of history at Exeter University. You're a professor of history. You have written many, many books on the Middle Ages, and you're an all-round expert. So I wanted to speak to you about one of the things that you've written about, which is the Normans. I don't actually have the physical copy, annoyingly, of your book on the Normans. I know you've got it in front of you, so you should show it on screen right now. There we go. He's showing it on screen right now for anyone who's just listening. Here's his other book on Ethelred the Unready, which is a great book. I've actually got your book on Kindle, but it was an excellent read. You're very good at spinning these complicated events together, these continent-spanning events together into a nice popular narrative, which is excellent. What is it about the Normans, Levi? They get absolutely everywhere. They're all over Europe for like 200 years. They're everywhere. How do they do it?
Well, I think that's one of the great mysteries with the Normans, in a sense, is that fact that they are so central to European history, but because they don't kind of really belong to any nation. They're not really 100% Frenchmen. They're not really owned by the Scandinavians anymore. They don't fit our narratives anymore, in a sense, and the narratives that 19th century nation states want. So they're this force that's hugely, hugely influential, yet also quite easy to overlook. And I think, in a sense, a lot of what makes them so important is that they're at the forefront of a series of movements that are just fundamental to European history, particularly Western European history, and by extension, therefore, actually more widely to world history. That there is a real moment between about kind of 900, around when the Normans are settling in Normandy, and around kind of about 1200, when we're capping off perhaps this high point of influence, when we see Europe transform and, in a sense, almost created in terms of Western Europe as we know it, and certainly medieval Europe as most of your listeners will think of it. So, before this point, we don't have castles. There are fortifications, but regular kind of castles. Deals of knightly existence, knight service, all of these kinds of things are cultural phenomena that are produced within this kind of context. And they're produced within kind of the heartlands, particularly of France, many of these kinds of things, and expand outwards from there. And the Normans aren't the only vectors of this, it must be admitted, but they are, I think, one of the most powerful and one of the earliest. So in a sense, they're amongst the trend setters of what are a set of trends that are hugely important. Rob Bartlett, a very, very highly regarded medieval historian, has spoken of the Europeanization of Europe, the creation of Europe as something, a real cultural entity, that before this point, there are actually kind of many Europes. That culture in Ireland is kind of pretty much unrecognizable. If you picked someone up in 900 from Ireland and dropped them in the north of Italy, they'd have had no clue what the hell was going on. 1200, they might not have been able to speak the language, but they'd have immediately been able to tell who was an aristocrat, who was a commoner, being able to gauge roughly how social relations should operate, and so on. And so this is this kind of really crucial moment where all sorts of things are happening, and a lot of this is happening at the end of a sword or spear point. And so that's one of the reasons why the Normans and their conquests are kind of an essential part of this story.
And it's a fascinating story. So, I mean, we've got Crusades, we've got the end of the Viking Age as well. Something that really interests me is, at what point do the Normans become these horse-riding knights that we would probably most recognise from the Bayeux Tapestry? At what point do they stop being Viking Northmen?
So this is a gradual process, but all indications are that it's happening relatively swiftly. So they're settling in and around what becomes Normandy, or the heart of it, around Rouen, in the early 10th century. The traditional date for the foundation of Normandy is about 911, but frankly, that's guesswork. We don't really know. Could have been a bit earlier, could have been a bit later. There were certainly some people around there from Scandinavia earlier. But when this happens, this is nothing new. So Western European rulers have had problems with Vikings for some time, and it wasn't uncommon to give them some of your land to partly to keep them happy, giving them a bit, but also normally giving them land on the coastline. So you're sort of setting a thief to catch a thief, or turning your poachers to gameskeepers. So it's kind of well-established tactic, and no one expects this to be any different than the earlier Scandinavian enclaves, all of which had kind of fizzled out after a few generations. What matters, though, is that this one survives, because it kind of arrives at a point when royal authority in France is kind of entering almost terminal decline. So it means they're able to get a much stronger toehold and develop themselves there. And what they really want, though, is like earlier Scandinavian groups, is they want a part of what they see in France. They're there initially looting and things like that, but the reason why they're settling is because they see it's wealthy land, but also they see that they're, that it's much more effective in a sense, rather than rocking up every other year and demanding some tribute, you can get the best returns on it by actually going there, establishing yourself as running the show on a permanent basis, rather than extorting protection money, taking over the entire business. And so that's what they're actually after. They want to be French aristocrats. They want to integrate in this culture. It doesn't mean that they're planning on going there, giving up their native culture completely or things like that. But fundamentally, that is kind of what they're about. And so already within the second generation, so the first generation, we have, Rollo, who is the great founder figure. His son is William. And so we already are seeing, if you will, a transition here. And thereafter, all of the leaders of the Normans have good French aristocratic names. So that's one of the kind of early symptoms. It doesn't mean they've stopped speaking Old Norse overnight. Many probably have two name forms for a while, but it does mean that there's this strong impetus already in there. Rollo himself is marrying into local families. William is doing so. So by the second generation, they're marrying local aristocrats. They are certainly capable of speaking French. By the third generation, they're largely Francophone. There have been some later arrivals, so they definitely are still like, Scandinavians, Vikings settling in the 940s and 950s. So up to about 1000, you're going to find pockets of people speaking a version of Old Norse, of the Viking language, in and around Normandy. But it's probably becoming fewer and fewer. And so it's even said that one of the ducal sons is sent off to the west of the duchy to learn Danish, the Danish tongue, the Old Norse. So there's hints that by that point, this is something that you still useful to be able to do, but no longer kind of crucial. So I'd say around 1000, we see this tipping point where this move becomes kind of pretty much inexorable. And thereafter, the Normans are culturally speaking Northern French. But they do see themselves as ethnically distinct. How far they see themselves as French, in inverted commas, is a very good question and by no means immediately clear. They'd see themselves as Francophone, French-speaking, but whether or not they'd identify as French and see Norman as a variety of French is not clear, and they do have a very clear sense of their own origins and their myths of origins. So Dudov Saint-Quentin, famously around that point when Norman identity is kind of crystallizing out around 1000, writes a history of the dukes. And it's in Latin, it's not in Old Norse. He himself is a Frenchman, Dudov Saint-Quentin, but it's kind of providing the sense of these mythical forebears. I think this is important for them for the future, because although culturally speaking, they're not very different from their neighbors, say, in Anjou, one of the things that is different is they do have this kind of myth of origin and this awareness that we came here, we conquered this land. And when you're asking, why do a bunch of them think, hey, let's go to Italy? Hey, 1066, why not? Let's take a high risks journey over to England to try to win the throne, knowing we could full well be defeated and it all come a cropper. Well, one of the things that is in play is an awareness that kind of, this is how we did it before. This is how we got Normandy. How do you think we got here, mate? So I do think that myth of origin is an important part in terms of that I don't think there's a kind of innate Normanness that makes the Normans more vicious than anyone else, because frankly, a lot of them probably are not of Scandinavian descent. Many of the aristocrats are, but by no means all. Some of these are doubtless local Frenchmen who've just married into this family. So I don't think they're actually any bigger and stronger than their neighbors. But they do have this kind of myth of origin that I think is something that helps propel them and give them a degree of self-confidence in an era where we're seeing self-confidence grow elsewhere and kind of across the board.
Self-confidence would be key. I mean, some of these battles that they fight over the sort of 200-300 years of their kind of existence before they kind of fade away, the historians write of them being 100 men versus 3,000 or whatever. They seem to be massively outmatched a lot of times. How much of that is propaganda, would you say?
I suspect a very large amount of it. I mean, nothing wins like winning.
Yeah.
And the Normans are good at talking themselves up, but also one of the things that's important is the recruitment strategy. If you're someone like William the Conqueror, if you're, Guiscard in southern Italy, Robert Guiscard, and you're trying to get people to up sticks from Normandy where life's nice and comfortable and decide that it's better to risk it on this, often petty aristocrats, so people of high enough standing, though, that they've got some good arms and armor. You want to convince them that they abandon a comfortable existence for something much higher risk. One of the things you want to be saying to them is, in a sense, this is a bit risky, but you want to be convincing them that, it is, as it were, cool, but also that the risk isn't so high. The Normans are many things.
We're going to win.
They're not complete idiots. And so you are trying to encourage them to do things that are risky and that they know is risky, but not foolhardy. And I think there's that fine line between the two. And so what they're trying to do is say, Hey, and one way to do that, though, is to exaggerate your victories when you get them, and to have this idea that you are invincible in terms of these things, when the Normans certainly are defeated and absolutely can be defeated, but they are willing to, in a way that by no means all peoples of this period do, those kinds of things, like, yeah, come over to England, fight a decisive battle at Hastings, a very close run thing, and something which, if it goes the other way, they're fundamentally screwed. Like, there's no real backup plan for what to do if that goes wrong. Um, but it does kind of pay off well when it works as well, because it's kind of like high stakes gambling. It's high losses potentially, but also high gains. And in terms of that, there are, and I expect we'll come on to these. There are some nice examples actually of the Normans are often successful, but actually in the long run, by no means always as well. They get toeholds in some places, they start state building in some places, and it gets too hard. And if the going gets too tough, they find somewhere where the tough can get going. And that may be somewhere else, in fact, rather than, sticking with a losing scenario. They're very good at also being canny, cutting their losses when they need to, moving on to somewhere where they can win.
They seem to move about a lot. Is it William the Conqueror's father who goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem?
Yes, yeah. So pilgrimage to Jerusalem is becoming much more popular in this period. And yes, his father does. And the Normans also have a strong tradition of pilgrimage to southern Italy, which may partly be how they end up there kind of in the first place. A place like Monte Gargano, where there's an important cult center for the archangel Michael. And Michael's kind of a particularly militant figure, a militant archangel, said to be one of the ones who kind of defeats Antichrist at the end of time. He's also very important, though, in Norman cult. So we have places like the important monastery of Mont Saint-Michel, literally the Mount of St. Michael in Normandy. So all of those kinds of things are drawing the Normans to the Mediterranean basis and to wider travel.
So when Robert goes on pilgrimage, is he going with an armed band of men, or is he really donning the pilgrim's cape, and is he, going along the old established paths that way?
Almost certainly, I'd imagine he'd be taking arms and armor with him, frankly. If not, he'd have other people with him who were. What we are seeing is we have other accounts of people from France, and he's part of a largish group that goes. So that's actually a big expedition that involves people from other parts of France, too.
It's a dangerous route.
It absolutely is, but one of the things is it is becoming less so. So one of the crucial things that has changed is that we're getting more interaction across the Mediterranean basin, so people know the sea routes better, but also we have the land route has opened. So Hungary has Christianized. So there's now a well-established land route, which is, of course, how the First Crusade then ends up going. So in terms of that, there is this increasing awareness that actually the Holy Land isn't too far. Before then, there's a sense that where you go on pilgrimage is normally Rome. And a place like Monte Gargano is just to the south and east of Rome. It's a bit further south, but again, that's often an offshoot of it. So pilgrims go to Rome and then say, oh, well, let's go a bit further to Gargano. But what starts happening as we move into the 11th century is actually saying, no, actually, we should go all the way to Holy Land or do a staged pilgrimage, go to Rome and then onwards. Rome, Monte Gargano in southern Italy, onto the Holy Land.
Yeah, it seems like he had to go one further. He had to one up everybody else and go all the way to Jerusalem. Is there one Duke of Normandy who's particularly powerful, particularly strong, who sort of like establishes the place as something that's here to stay? Before William, I'm talking. We've not got to the Norman conquest yet. Or is it just they're all strong and powerful?
They are all. So they're very fortunate that the initial dukes all do seem to be very capable. So Rollo and William provide solid foundations without which it wouldn't have happened. Following William Longsword's death, who's the second Duke of Normandy, there is a kind of a crisis moment because he's assassinated by the Count of Flanders, who's kind of a bit of a competitor in northern France for power and influence, and also for controlling the kind of coastline of northern France into the Low Countries. So that does lead to an initial crisis point, but out of it then they re-emerge. And the next two figures are probably some of the really crucial ones, Richard I and Richard II. And it's under them that we start seeing terms being used like Normanny as an ethnic designator, because the term for Normans just means, as some of your listeners will know, but by no means all potentially, Northmen. Which is one of the standard terms for Vikings in mainland Europe in this period. So it's originally a designator for Vikings that then comes to have a very specific meaning, however, that by the 11th century, if you speak of Normanny, certainly by the later 11th century, it no longer, to a Latin writer or speaker, means inhabitants of Denmark or Norway or Sweden at all. It means people who live in a very specific part of northern France. And that transition comes because, in a sense, what's distinctive of these northern Frenchmen is that they are originally from the north. And it is in the kind of 990s that we start seeing that term being used seemingly more widely as an ethnic designator. And we also start seeing Nordmania or Normania being used as a geographical term, i.e. Normandy. So the idea that the land of the Northmen isn't anymore Denmark, Sweden, Norway. At least not if you're based anywhere near northern France. If you're in Paris and you talk about Normania, by the 990s, early years after the turn of the first millennium, you mean Normandy as you and I would now recognize it, with not identical frontiers, but quite similar. So that, what I'd say, is a crucial moment. And it's around that period, one of our witnesses to this, but by no means the only one, is Dudo of Saint-Quentin, who writes this history of the early dukes. Quite mythical. Its early material is, historically speaking, next to useless as evidence for what is really happening in the early 10th century in Normandy. But what it is brilliant for and really useful is understanding what's going on from the 990s onwards. He starts writing it in the 990s and finishes it in the early years, probably the 1010s. He was writing it for quite a period of time, seemingly. But it's a brilliant insight into what's going on then at the Norman court as this kind of ethnicity is forming and as it's coming into being. And what's important there as well is, of course, that this identity is becoming one that's kind of distinctive to Normandy. It's solidifying, and it now seems to designate anyone from there. It's not exclusive to the aristocrat. So peasants, many of whom would not be of Scandinavian descent, anyone kind of who's under the dukes, is now qualifying as Norman in that sense. So that's kind of your birth moment, if you will, I'd say, that although all of those rulers are crucial, it's that point at which we start having a relatively clear sense of a kind of an ethnicity, an identity, a distinct sovereign polity.
So by the start of the 11th century, it's well and truly a thing, the Norman thing. I've got to ask you about one particular individual who has many, many, many sons, all of whom pretty much become very important figures. Tancred de Hauteville. How has he got this brood of warrior sons who all become really capable? It's crazy.
It's a wonderful question, and the short answer, we don't really know, because Tancred's a bit of a nobody. He's from the Cotentin in Normandy, and one of the reasons why his sons go everywhere seems to be that he's got lots. So it's two sets of half-brothers as well. So he's had two spouses, substantial numbers of sons with both. And this is a problem if you're an aristocrat, because you're trying to maintain status generation to generation. And it's quite clear there isn't enough to go around for the Hauteville. So that's probably part of it, is that they are facing actually a bit of a crisis. There's not enough. And the tradition in Normandy is partible inheritance, as it is in large parts of France this period. So they're looking at kind of relative deprivation, perhaps sliding out of aristocratic status, certainly to very low down the pecking order, and they're not very high up if they stay in Normandy. So there's a big pull factor for these people to do something else to kind of better themselves. And so that's almost certainly part of it. Whether or not there's something in the way he raised them is a wonderful question, and we can't kind of answer that, unfortunately. The other thing that then changes is that once a group of these become established in southern Italy, the kind of first generation William Ironarm and people like that, there then is a starting point for their younger half-brothers. And that, I think, is important, because that then gives people like Robert Guiscard, who ends up becoming the figure, the kind of William the Conqueror figure for southern Italy, if you need to name one person, but it's a much more collective enterprise there. But he kind of ends up being the front man for this big movement. But he has a toehold already. He has elder half-brothers who've started this process, whose shoulders he can, in a sense, stand on, and whose achievements he can seek to build on, but also, in a sense, seek to replicate. Because one of the things that's very fascinating with that family is that we've got these sets of half-brothers, and they do kind of work together, but they're also quite competitive, because in a sense, they're freebooters. They're out there knowing they're not going to get much from dad, so they've got to make it on their own. And they're at the same time also then competitors. So one of the things that happens when, Robert himself goes south initially, and his elder half-brothers have been having some success establishing kind of initial lands and a toehold in southern Italy, he goes there and says, hey, I'm here, guys. And they say, great, sod off. We don't actually have that much land here. No, you're not welcome. It's ours. Go win yourself something. You can have the land over there, and point to where we've not won any of it yet. Go win it for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, go conquer that castle.
And so I think there's actually a little bit of both that is key to the success for them as well there. That on the one hand, he does in the end inherit some of the responsibilities of his brothers, and it is easier as a family member. He'll more likely to acknowledge you. So he is able to be a successor of sorts to his half-brothers. But at the same time, actually, the competitiveness, I think, is also part of the success. There's a kind of awareness for all of them that I'm not going to achieve this on my own, and I'm not going to be given it on a silver platter, even by my own family, because in fact, we've all come here because there isn't enough for us in Normandy. And so we're not going to be immediately inclined to be sharing it with, our annoying younger half-brothers.
I suppose that need to prove yourself to actually get power is possibly one of the reasons why they're so successful as well. It seems like to me they're not going to put somebody in charge who isn't capable. It seems like a bit of a meritocracy. I mean, would that be fair to say?
I think to some extent, but to a
To
very
some degree.
qualified extent. And I would
course,
suggest
yeah.
that it's much more so in a place like southern Italy, where they're initially coming to conquer. That's kind of a bit of a wild west. Moments of conquest are ones where, frankly, you want someone leading you who's capable, regardless of whether or not they're from the traditional ruling family. In Normandy itself, the Hautevilles would never have become dukes. So there's an established sense of hierarchy, and hierarchies tend to become entrenched because for the very good reasons that most of us, if we're successful, financially or otherwise in the modern world, we want to be able to give a bit of that to our next generation. Elites and status tend to be, in all societies, at least partially heritable. So you should be expecting that. Elites tend to replicate in terms of ruling. It doesn't mean we may not like it, ideologically or otherwise, but that is a very natural tendency. And so whereas in a place like Normandy, you do have an established polity, I would say that I wouldn't kind of describe that as a meritocracy because, frankly, the next duke is going to be the son of the previous duke, is normally designated by him, and may or may not be very competent. Actually, most of them in the 10th and 11th century are quite competent. They're quite fortunate that way. But there's by no means a guarantee of this. Not all of William the Conqueror's sons are equally able. Not all of Henry II's sons much later are famously equally able.
Of course.
But they all
of
end up
course,
becoming rulers because there's the structures that, in a sense, enable them to rule even if they're not. But in moments
Of
of
course.
conquest, where where there isn't a clear hierarchy, the people who get to the top are going to be typically amongst those who maybe already have a slight edge on the others, but also those who prove themselves time and again. And it maybe they get that edge not by initial standing, but by bloody-minded success on the battlefield, in politics against their competitors, and otherwise.
So those Hauteville brothers, they are really in the right place, right time then, because by the end of their story, they are anointed monarchs of Europe.
Yeah, so eventually, the very end of the story with the creation of a Norman polity in southern Italy is initially they established themselves as kind of dukes in this area. And it must be noted that these terms in the Middle Ages are very nebulous and flexible. So, William the Conqueror is duke in Normandy, not king. That is nominally a bit lower down. He's not consecrated into this role with holy oil, and that is a qualitative difference and so on. The King of France is a king, that's grander. But the King of France has no say what goes on in Normandy. The King of France twice marches in with an army into Normandy and is beaten by William and his men and has to leave with his tail between his legs. So, this is not the case of a king who can command William what to do. William would have laughed and stuck two fingers up. And it's somewhat like that in the south. The Hauteville brothers established themselves as dukes, and Guiscard there is a completely autonomous duke. There is no king or emperor who tells him what to do, not if they value their life and security. But it is true, though, that they do have these high aspirations. It's said that Guiscard in particular wanted to take down the Byzantine Empire, and he does attack it, and there's actually some indications that, because the Byzantines are looking a bit ropey in this period, that he does kind of have this on his mind. If he could play his cards just right or get the moment right, he almost certainly would have had a go for it. But he definitely has these overweening ambitions. And what is noteworthy is that eventually Roger, descendant of the same family but through his younger full brother, so if you will, the full line, it so happens that they end up succeeding as the main line of this, but then does establish himself as Roger the First of Sicily, is fully crowned, does achieve that in ideological terms, higher level status, acknowledgement of this from the Pope eventually, who's not entirely thrilled by all of this. But, there is that sense that eventually they establish themselves amongst that elite of the elite, and indeed their descendants go on to become Holy Roman Emperors.
That's Frederick, right?
Yeah, so Frederick II eventually, who's of the union between that dynasty and the so-called Staufer rulers. So Frederick II has his name from his grandfather, Frederick Barbarossa, but his original name is Frederick Roger.
Well,
And
there we go.
Roger is a Sicilian Norman name. And again, you can kind of tell this because it's not a traditionally Southern Italian name. You can tell by the names that these rulers have. Robert Guiscard, Robert, William, Roger, they give themselves names that, although they kind of settle and go local, go native and start speaking a dialect of Southern Italian, they still give their sons names that are French names and that are redolent of an origin in Normandy.
So they're still seeing themselves as Norman then?
That is tricky to say
Difficult.
because you're trying to get inside
Yeah.
their heads. And we're dealing with people who've moved around a lot at a period where ethnicity can sometimes be quite firm, but sometimes quite flexible. So I'm not entirely sure. Up until the 1170s, 80s, 90s, we have some accounts talking about some of these members of the Hauteville family preferring Francophone favorites and things like that. So there's hints that there still is sometimes a preference for French speakers and people can come from Normandy to their courts and make a career. So they're well aware they're from Normandy. Whether or not, if you put them on the spot and said, are you Calabrian, are you Sicilian, or are you Norman, they would have said simply Norman, is a bit less clear, but probably some of them some of the time, and they'd certainly have said that they were of that kind of descent. They were well aware of that origin, and again, their names, they have that dynastic pride of being of the Hauteville clan, who are unmistakably of Norman origin. So I think in that sense, they still have markers that at the very least allow us as modern observers to see you're not kind of garden variety Southern Italians, even if, if put on the spot, they would first reach for saying, well, I'm kind of Sicilian, I'm Calabrian. That it should be noted that Southern Italy is, although they're ruling these areas in a unified manner, and they're ruling most of Southern Italy, there isn't a single designator traditionally for this area in Italy. So there are these kind of, Apulia, Calabria, these different names that are being used.
So we've spoken about Robert Guiscard a little bit there. This could bring us nicely onto the Crusades, actually, because the Normans were a big part of the First Crusade, and a big part of the First Crusade was Robert Guiscard's son, Bohemond. What do we know about Bohemond?
So Bohemond is one of these larger-than-life figures, literally as well as metaphorically. So Bohemond has his name, reportedly, from the fact that at his father, Robert Guiscard's court, there was a kind of, an entertainer, a kind of figure at feasts and things like that, telling stories, and was telling a story of this giant and of ancient lore called Bohemond, because Bohemond's not previously a name. And Bohemond's name, it should be said, that's actually not his, Christian name. He wasn't Christian Bohemond. He's Mark, actually, technically, but no one calls him Mark. So His original name is Mark. And that's actually fascinating because Mark is a Greek name. So there's this hint, and he's Robert's son from his first marriage. Ironically, his marriage with a fellow Norman noblewoman. They choose to give their son the name Mark, which suggests a kind of initial move to try to accommodate to local culture. But when he then remarries to Sicilgaita, who's a local princess, their children all get Norman names. And I think this is kind of a moment of transition where they're moving in self-confidence, if you will, from this. And what happens to kind of Bohemond as a consequence of this, and this is relevant to the Crusades, is unfortunately for him, he gets kind of ousted from the line of succession, because although there's no reason to doubt that his mother was, rightfully married to his father, there's some hints that maybe they were too closely related, but probably that's a later excuse. Effectively, she's been shunted aside because he got offered a better bride, and a bride he needed, because again, he's conquering southern Italy. How better to shore up your legitimacy than to marry into local ruling dynasties that will make you appeal to the local aristocrat? So it's a very canny move for Robert, but it's less good of a move for Bohemond, his one son from the previous marriage, who now looks at this and is basically told, no, you're not getting the succession to the ducal throne. You can have, a few lands and things like that. But to come back to kind of the core part of the story, his name comes from the fact that there's this a person at the court telling this tale of this giant Bohemond, and Robert reportedly thought this was so wonderful, and so amusing. He said, my son, who was famously this massive, massive child already, I'll call him Bohemond. I'm going to call him that from now on. So it was kind of a kind of a blokey joke, if you will, from this kind of, hyper masculine court that then sticks, and everyone just calls him Bohemond. So, it's a bit like, I think on sports teams, particularly famous in the rugby teams and things like that nobody actually goes by their real names. It's kind of, that's his kind of joke name from his dad that sticks because He's literally the size of a giant. He's bigger than anyone else. And our reports of him in life say Bohemond was physically imposing, a hugely impressive individual, known for being extremely canny and clever as well, but very skilled in war, an experienced general, and because he's sitting there in southern Italy with no real future prospects. Certainly not as he might have hoped and wanted for his status. When he hears of the First Crusade, Bohemond's off like a shot. Great. I need to win a kingdom of my own. My younger brothers are going to edge me out unless I manage to kind of defeat them in battle. And he does rebel a few times and things like that. But his options are limited there. First Crusade is a great thing to kind of tag along. And everyone's doing this. This is my opportunity. And so he brings a large cohort to this endeavor, as well as some really relevant know-how, because he's already in the Mediterranean. A lot of the rest of the forces are coming from France. So he speaks Greek. He has Greek name, technically. He has a better sense of how the Byzantines operate, knows to be wary of them. He and his father have already clashed horns with them, but already has a much better sense, if you will, of the lay of the land. And so he's happy to kind of join in on this. But what's also very clear from day one is he's, number one, looking to use this, if possible, as a way to get back at the Byzantine Empire. Because he and his father, I've alluded to the fact that Robert had kind of wanted to conquer the Byzantine Empire. They actually make a go of it in the 1080s with Bohemond. And one of the reasons for this is perhaps try to get Bohemond his own kingdom, so he doesn't have to threaten his younger half-brothers. That doesn't succeed, but they have some initial successes. They win some major battles. So he's kind of got unfinished business, and the Crusades perhaps a way of getting over there, and if the stars align correctly, from getting one back at the Byzantine emperor. But failing that, and independent from that, win his own fame and fortune. And it's very clear that Bohemond's out to look after one person's interests in and around the First Crusade in the Holy Land, and that is Bohemond's. And so you see this very well, that, in the early stages of the Crusade, he plays crucial moments in early victories in Asia Minor, in getting them to Antioch, and then winning the siege of Antioch. He's the one who gets a turncoat on the walls, but then he gets a concession from his fellow Crusade leaders that if he can take Antioch, he can keep it, basically. And this is crucial because Antioch is part of old Byzantine lands, and they promised the Byzantine emperor to give them all back if they won them. And then only lands beyond the old Byzantine territories could they keep for themselves. Bohemond at this point says, "Sod that. I've got now what I need, the startings of a nice polity of my own. Enjoy the trip to Jerusalem, rest of you. Best of luck. Hope it's not too tough. I'm just going to sit the rest of this one out. Achieved what I wanted." And so that's what he does. And he founds, though, a prominent princely dynasty there. And you can see that Norman pedigree, because we have these so-called Crusader states set up, but the only one that's called a principality, where they call themselves princes, is Antioch. And prince is the traditional title used for royal families in southern Italy. So you've got this kind of a very interesting lineage where you can see that kind of distinctly southern Italian imprint on the kind of kingdom of Antioch.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because he must have had designs on the Byzantine Empire through his father. You think that his father had probably told him about this place. And we also know that there were lots of Normans already in Byzantium as mercenaries. Can we say anything about those guys in the 1070s, is it? When they sort of up to no good?
Yes. So there's a series of major Norman mercenaries. And this actually comes back to the early Norman settlement in southern Italy. So a number of the initial Normans who settled there, including William Ironarm, William de Hauteville. So they're the eldest of these sets of brothers and half-brothers. So the elder half-brother of Robert Guiscard. He starts off as a kind of mercenary in southern Italy. And one of the people he serves under, actually, himself, is he serves for the Byzantines as they're trying to reconquer Sicily from the Arab Emirate there. That's been established for quite some time. And they serve very successfully there. The campaign doesn't ultimately end in success, but they more than prove their mettle. And so from the perspective of the Byzantines, this is good news. And so they clearly move a bunch of them, including this chap Roger Crispin, seemingly, from there back to Byzantium. Not all of them go back. Some, like William Ironarm, don't. But a portion of these forces go back to Byzantium in the kind of 1020s. 1030s. And from then on, there's always some kind of Norman forces within Byzantine forces up until at least the 1070s. They're kind of amongst our regular mercenaries and very effective ones. But what is striking is, of course, that mercenaries have long been employed by the Byzantines. They know the dangers of this, but they are inevitably slightly higher risk because, your own forces, you hope, at least ideally speaking, have a degree of ideological commitment to your cause. They hopefully share elements of your ethnicity, the ideology of your regime. They've got an investment in maintaining the status quo. Mercenaries have an investment in getting the most money they can for the least effort. And they will simply weigh up offers and options as they come. And so one of the tendencies that established itself really quite early is that these Norman mercenaries, while highly effective in battle, their loyalty cannot always be trusted. And there's a series of revolts already kind of starting in the 1050s, 1060s, but you've alluded to there in the 1070s in the aftermath of the Battle of Manzikert, which is where the Seljuk Turks have been coming in. And so what's happening here is that Byzantium has for some time now held securely large parts of Greece, at least, and most of what we'd now call kind of modern Turkey, Asia Minor. And that's particularly Asia Minor. Turkey is their kind of core heartlands. Those are their wealthiest lands in terms of Byzantine administration. And for quite a few hundred years now, they've not faced immediate existential threat there. That has existed in the past, but it's not been the case for some time. And what disrupts all this is the arrivement of these Turkic people who are coming in from Asia Minor. They're a people a bit like the earlier Huns or the later Mongols. So their language is not Arabic. They are Muslim, but they speak a Turkic language, which is a different language, and they defeat the Byzantines in a major battle and start eating up this territory. And this is really problematic if you're the Byzantines, particularly because of the way the Byzantine Empire works, which is like the Roman Empire, based on taxation. You lose your most valuable territories, you lose your tax base, you lose your ability to raise your armies, because their armies are still, to a significant extent, professional armies dependent on that tax base. So it's quite easy to kind of enter a death spiral. And it's looking in the 1070s like they're starting to enter one of these. And it's at this precise moment that we then have a major Norman revolt, clearly deciding the prospects of this regime are not looking good. And the other thing that's said in a number of these Norman revolts, and it's suggested that they perhaps were not being paid either the amount they'd agreed upon, what they thought they were worth, payments were being delayed. That's also entirely believable. So you're looking at this and thinking, they're not paying up anymore, or we're not sure they'll be able to for very long. They're looking really shaky. But there's a real opportunity. But what if we cut off the head? Because this is also quite a centralized, powerful state. So there is that option, a bit like the Normans do, and indeed have already at this point done in England in 1066, of replacing the regime with one of our own. And so that's something that is attempted in this major revolt in the 1070s, where they defeat imperial forces. They besiege Constantinople itself. At that point, it's an overreach. By the time they get to Constantinople, they're not able to really make much of the siege. So this is, again, one of those kind of perhaps false starts, but it's also not that far off. It's not inconceivable that a Norman could have taken over Constantinople, and that history would be on a very, very different trajectory. So, as you say, there have been these Norman revolts, and the crucial thing is that those Normans serving in Byzantium, most of them seem to have been recruited from southern Italy. And so this means that people like Bohemond know full well about this. Robert Guiscard know full well about this. And so when Bohemond and Guiscard go over, it's in the early 1080s. Again, Byzantine Empire is still looking pretty weak. They've overcome that Norman revolt, but it's looking pretty dodgy. And they clearly know about these highly successful Norman revolts that their own countrymen have within, the previous kind of decade been laying siege to Constantinople, setting up alternative emperors, things like that, getting up to these kinds of escapades.
The Battle of Dorylaeum, as the First Crusaders are moving across Anatolia against the Turks, it seems to me that the Normans are kind of invaluable at that battle in leading the charge back against the Turks. I mean, do we think that some of them had fought Turks before in Bohemond's force?
It's entirely possible, and certainly they'd have had contact with people who potentially had or fought similar kinds of forces, because while the Turks are highly successful, what they're doing in terms of that, fighting on horseback, shooting with bow and arrows, that's not, coming like a complete bolt from the blue. In Asia, because of the larger steppe territories there, it's much more common than Europe, and so there are groups like the Pechenegs and things like that have been troubling the Byzantine Empire for some time that probably fight on a similar model. So I would say he almost certainly has at least a few people who fought in a similar way, and there would be a wider cultural understanding that would almost certainly be greater than, say, the other Normans, some of the other Normans on this expedition, because there's a separate group who have come with Robert Curthose, who's the
Yes.
eldest son
Yes.
of William the Conqueror.
We'll
So there's actually
we'll
two
move on
Norman
to him
groups here.
in a moment. Yeah.
But the specific group, as you say, it's Bohemond's troops that are said to be decisive there. And the likelihood that Bohemond and at least some of them have a pretty good idea of those kinds of tactics and what's going on here is very high.
Yeah, the whole horse archery thing, it's not a thing that's done in Northern Europe, is it? It's not a thing that the Anglo Saxons are going to be exposed to.
No, and it's with good reason, actually, because although it can be highly effective, it is noteworthy if you look across time. The Huns, these groups, they create problems in Europe, but none of them actually end up conquering all of Europe. And one of the reasons for this is to have very effective forces like that, you've got to have lots of horses, which means lots of pasture land, which means you need steppes. There is one steppe in Europe. It is in Hungary. That's where the Huns settle. That's where the Magyars settled. That's where, if the Mongols had got there, they'd have settled. But it's not a very large steppe, actually.
The Avars before them.
The Avars, but it's not actually very large steppe lands. So compared to what you get in Asia, it's not that much. And the other thing is they're usually using what are called compound bows. Highly effective. They're able to make bows powerful at a much smaller scale than like the later longbow of Welsh fame. But those kinds of bows are much more exposed to rain. Rain makes them far less effective. They need to get dry. So that's fine if you're fighting mostly in Anatolia, where it's dry much of the year. If you're fighting in Wales with a bow that doesn't work in the rain, if you're going to be going to, Northern Ireland or the west of Ireland with a bow that doesn't work in the rain, you may as well go there with a chocolate teapot, really. It's going to be not very useful. And we do have accounts of some of these other groups earlier, like for example, the Magyars or Hungarians, losing battles when it's been said to be raining. And now that's probably one of the contributing factors. So that's kind of one of the reasons why most people in France wouldn't have been exposed to this kind of warfare, but it's also not taken off because actually, although it's highly effective when it works, it's not very practical day in, day out in Western Europe.
Robert Curthose, what's the name? What does that mean? It's like shorty pants or something given to him by his father.
Or hose, short trousers or pants. Hose can be kind of, they can be underhose or they can be trousers more widely. But it is, yes, it's a bit of a joking name and it does seem to be belittling. And one of the things that is noteworthy is that poor Robert is edged out of things a bit by his father. I mean, he has this rather unfortunate experience. I mean, it's not, I think, easy actually for any of the Conqueror's sons, really. It's a bit of the kind of, King Charles phenomenon, that if you've got a highly successful monarch who breeds young, you're going to get a high probability of adult male sons who've been bred to do one thing, and one thing only, really, rule, who can't do it and don't know when they'll get to do it. And so that's the story of, William is doing great in the 1060s and 1070s. It's great to have quite a few sons around. You've got your heirs and your spares. You need those with high rates of mortality. By the time you get to the 1080s, they're all looking around and saying, when is this guy going to die? That even I'm sure medieval sons loved their fathers genuinely. I suspect they did in their own way, but they're starting to get decidedly antsy, and it ends up becoming acute with Curthose, because Curthose desperately, he's the eldest. He is the senior heir. He's the one who's having to wait the longest. And for William, though, here's where you get those tensions. William is still, in many respects, at the height of his powers. The more power and influence he gives to Robert or any of his sons, the less he has for himself. There is a degree to which this is a zero-sum game. Only one of us can be king, but actually, even if I set you up, as he does Robert in Normandy, but how much do I give you control? Can I still make decisions in Normandy? William absolutely can. He's not willing to cede that fully. Understandably, because if not, I'm giving you a base for revolting against me. And, trying to do me one, because you'd benefit from that, and so on. So it does create this real tension in terms of it. And William seems to be trying to stop Robert from, for example, getting married, establishing his own family. And again, that's very conscious. Robert wants to do this because it's essential for his future dynastic prospects. But for William, he's got younger sons. He doesn't really care if Robert Curthose has heirs that much, actually, as long as some of them do. And the more he has heirs, the more he's lined up not only himself as William's replacement, but a replacement for the replacement, which strengthens him. So William needs heirs of his own to strengthen his position, but he doesn't want his heirs to have heirs because that then strengthens their position, not his. So there's a series of things that end up having these, chaps at loggerheads, because frankly, they're both trying to be, in terms of, are raised to be alpha males. And, William actually wants his son to be able to be there after he's dead. but not a moment sooner. And for his sons, of course, they want that as soon as possible. And particularly for Curthose, it ends up becoming acute, which is why we get revolt, and quite possibly why in his later years we also start seeing the first rifts, for example, between William and his wife Matilda, who seem to have been a real pair most of his reign. But there's again hints that by the late 1070s, 1080s, is just around the time kind of where she slightly predeceases him, but where she dies, that actually she's starting to say, because she's also got the interests of her sons at heart and starting to favor her son.
So that's why Robert goes on crusade. He's trying to prove something.
Exactly. So although the crusade's happening a good bit after his father's now died, but he's not managed to succeed to the Kingdom of England. Now, that was probably always planned, that would go to William's second son, William II. And that's both good and bad news for Robert. In a sense, William has given him the traditional familial lands, actually. And we see this with most Norman families. They often give a second son the lands in England. So that in some sense it comes with more kudos, but it's also the worst lands. Normandy's good, but it's not actually England. It's not as wealthy. It's not as big. It's not a royal title. So it is a little bit of a snub still.
Yeah,
exactly. So he wants it all, and he doesn't get it all. It's clear. So he's been edged out of that, and you do have that sense of, well, what have you achieved, mate? Your dad conquered England, and so that's almost certainly part of the thinking here, is that he's trying to achieve that. One of the other people who goes on crusade is Stephen of Blois. Stephen's wife is a daughter of William the Conqueror. And so we do have a number of these people who are directly connected or indirectly connected to some of these Norman ventures. We have Bohemond. And so one of the things that's recently been suggested, I think very plausibly, is that, when you're asking, why do these aristocrats from Western Europe, when told, hey, let's go to the Holy Land and try to reconquer it, say, great idea, rather than, you're effing crazy, mate,
Yeah.
No, that's really, really risky
idea, yeah.
and really, really dumb.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why it's been suggested that they don't is actually a lot of them have relatives who've done something similarly risky. That if you're the son of the conqueror, well, that's how Dad did it. Dad took big risks, big gain. If you're Stephen of Blois, my father-in-law did something really risky, gained a lot. If you're Bohemond, my dad did something really risky, gained a lot. You can see why for those people, actually, the kind of cost-benefit analysis might be weighted towards it. Even when we might look and say, yeah, crusading, the overall success rates of crusades, if we do the maths on all the crusades, they weren't a great idea, statistically speaking. Let's be honest.
But the first one...
put aside all of the rest of what went on there, but even just in terms of success rates, not a very good idea. But actually, they get tons of people who say, great, sign me up.
Yeah. But I suppose, with the first crusade, it is actually a bit successful. Well, it's quite successful. And it's the first one. So there's no precedent for a failure. So
and that's one of the reasons why then the subsequent ones. It is also notable that not only does the first crusade recruit well, another person who's related through marriage to crusaders is Raymond of Saint-Gilles, one of the southern French, the other kind of really big player. So there's this web. They're almost all connected to earlier Norman conquerors. So I think there's this sense of, they've got a model for this, and then the First Crusade creates a model. But it is notable that the First Crusade recruits very well, very high-level aristocrats, better than I think the Pope would have dreamed, but it still isn't getting the monarchs. They are still not saying, oh, great, yeah, sign me up, I'll risk an entire kingdom on this. By the Second Crusade, they are. And that is one of the notable shifts. Yeah. Second and Third Crusades, suddenly monarchs are willing to do this. And again, I think that's because actually they're not wanting to be one-upped. And again, another kind of nice vignette that shows us this, I think, is not with the Crusades itself, but it said of William the Conqueror that one of the reasons why he went out and conquered England is he said that it would be dishonourable if a man of lower birth, Robert Guiscard, achieved more than me, because he was aware of what's going on in southern Italy. And this is in William of Malmesbury writing in the 1120s. We don't know if that's exactly what William said. But I think at a deeper level, it's almost entirely true. In terms of a mindset, yes, because we know William knows what's going on in southern Italy. We know that, Bohemond and these people know what their parents and grandparents have achieved. And then we can connect that to the First Crusade, and then we can connect the ripple effects to that, to then subsequent crusading endeavors and other endeavors of conquest, not only ones that are kind of official crusades. Romans end up, attacking and taking over large parts of Wales, of Ireland. All of these are not low-risk endeavors, but again, there's by now a model for how and why one does these things.
So just before we get finally to Britain and we start talking about a bit of Wales and Ireland, I just wanted to ask, in terms of the Principality of Antioch forms, Bohemond rules over it. Is it in any way a Norman state, or is it just ruled by a few Normans, but it's still entirely, Byzantine?
There definitely is some of the signature there. There's a very good question as to how much the Crusaders' states are Norman in inverted commas. The Normans contribute not inconsiderably to them, but the vast majority of people in that state are not of Norman descent. Well, one needs to be pretty open about that. Even are not of European descent. One of the things that's noteworthy is that within a few generations, the crusading states look very odd to Western Europeans because people adjust themselves to local traditions. It's to be expected. Whether or not it's their aim from the start or not, they simply will. But there are, I think, some of those kind of traditions. So the name itself, as I mentioned, the principality. The names they give themselves dynastically tell you something about self-identity. Bohemond may not originally be a Norman name from Normandy, but it becomes a Hauteville name of that line only. So they end up calling their sons typically Bohemond, or when they're not, Tancred's another name used, which is Bohemond's younger brother. Is his brother. So we have these names that end up being, so Tancred and Bohemond, which are not names in the Middle East at all. The only place to look to for those names is the Hauteville family from southern Italy. So in that sense, one might say they're not Norman in the same way maybe that Robert Guiscard is. They're better described as kind of Italo-Norman. They are of that specific lineage of Normans from southern Italy. And I think here's where we kind of can start seeing, though, how by this point the Norman movement becomes harder to detect and is becoming a bit fissile already by around 1100, and it becomes increasingly so. So that by a kind of about 1200 or so, you've got people of Norman descent doing all sorts of stuff, ruling large parts of Europe. But if you got them all together, they wouldn't have said they were of the same ethnicity. They wouldn't have seen the similarity. Then in a sense, Normanness has become so ubiquitous that it's no longer meaningful. And in a sense, it's, okay, yeah, we may all, if you pointed out to them, be Norman. Some of them might have been aware of that. But what kind of Norman now are you? In that sense, what variety of this are you? Are you British Norman? And so by certainly by about 1200, the aristocracy in Britain is largely francophone, and they call themselves Anglais if you ask them who they are. Which may sound completely counterintuitive to us, where we think language and identity should go together. They're proud to be speaking French because that's what aristocrats speak, and of course they're English because that's how English aristocrats behave.
Of course,
don't be daft, mate.
Yeah.
We're French-speaking English, and so that starts becoming the kind of the trend in the direction of travel, which, as I say, is I think kind of how it's now easy to forget these things because they starts off as one story and ends up in a sense necessarily becoming lots of different stories.
Very quickly, before we get to the Cambro-Normans, the Norman conquest of Ireland and all this, the Reconquista. We've gone on a trip all around Europe, so let's just briefly talk about Spain. Normans in Spain, is it similar to the Byzantine Empire, or what's going on? We've got mercenaries there.
Yeah, so again, it's very similar seemingly to Byzantium, probably slightly fewer involved, but from a similar point of origin. And indeed, some of those involved seem to have been involved in southern Italy and Byzantium. So there's basically, Normans are available for hire in and around the Mediterranean. Right. And so it's in this context that we have, in two different moments of the Reconquista, Normans brought in, kind of hired in, and to a certain extent at least going rogue and setting up their own polities. And again, there's actually very little, if you're looking at these, to distinguish what's going on here, to particularly what's going on in southern Italy. What's going on in southern Italy is not like the Norman conquest of England. Norman conquest of England is kind of fascinating, but that William comes over with extreme force. While it's high risk, there is a very good chance, everybody in England knows in October 1066, that there's a good chance William will be on the throne next year. They don't necessarily know, is it 50-50? Is it 60-40 in his favor? Is it 70-30 against him? But it's something in that realm. Everybody knows this. Whereas it's very different in southern Italy. When William Ironarm is starting and serving under the Byzantines in Sicily, the chances that his younger half-brother is going to be Duke, ruling at least as overlord of almost all the southern half of Italy, they are extremely long. They are nothing like that. 1 in 10 if you're being extremely generous. And so it's a movement that starts small, but those chances get better as they're successful. And so it grows. And so what we see in places like Byzantium, or what we see in Iberia, in Catalonia, at these moments, is moments that could have gone this way. Another nice moment is we have in the context of the Second Crusade, this force that helps capture Lisbon. And so Lisbon becoming part of the Portuguese kingdom is achieved by partly Norman forces and wouldn't have happened without them. And that same force then goes over and seems to settle in Catalonia, some of them. And so we have surnames that are of Anglo-Norman extraction that go on for generations there. So we can kind of see the effects. But what happens is that those kinds of moments that we see there or in Byzantium are snuffed out early enough that they don't grow to be bigger. In a sense, it's almost like what happened to the earlier Viking enclaves in France before the foundation of Normandy. Or indeed, even when Normandy's founded, there is a lot of writers distinguish the Northmen of the Seine, which is the Normans we know them, and the Northmen of the Loire. There's another really big group on the Loire, which is the other big river in kind of Western France. So you kind of need to distinguish because there's these two groups and they're both settled. They're both autonomous. And the Normans of the Loire, the Northmen of the Loire, disappear after a generation or two. So I think there's always this sense that when you're doing something like this, particularly if you're not doing it with a massive army of conquest, you're going to need to get a toehold. That, there's an element of risk there. You're going to need to grow and develop that, an element of risk there. And so you've kind of got to be successful when the odds are at best evens, and sometimes worse than that, multiple times over before the overall chances of establishing something big are there. And so that's kind of what we have in the Iberian scenario, like with the Byzantine one. We have the starting point that doesn't look too different from southern Italy. It's probably not appreciably worse, but it doesn't grow, and so the additional recruits don't come in, and it disappears. It's a bit of a dead end. But again, a reminder that history isn't always about the success stories, and that there is a world in which the Normans are actually playing a crucial role in Spain. They're not unimportant. They still play some very crucial moments in Iberian history. As I say, that Lisbon as the Portuguese capital arguably wouldn't have happened, certainly not the way it did, without the Normans. But the impact isn't perhaps as transformative as on the British Isles or on southern Italy.
Very interesting. Certainly a place where the Normans are very successful initially, but then they sort of fade away, is in Ireland. And it's quite an interesting one. What can you tell me about Strongbow?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could say they fade away, but if the Normans, or Anglo-Normans, as we might better call them by this point, crucially, they're this group that are coming in that we can see are of Norman extraction, Francophone aristocrats, but who identify as English. But when they come over to Ireland, in terms of this, they are, of course, creating a tradition which, for, better or worse, goes down to 1920, 21, creation of the Irish Free State, and so on. And so while they don't conquer all of Ireland maybe the way they do England, that's because of the nature of the beast they're grappling with, because they're dealing with an island that is very subdivided politically. So Ireland isn't a highly unified polity. So while previous historical assessments was probably exaggerated quite how divided it is, the crucial point is that there's lots of different monarchs in Ireland and patterns of over-kingship and dominance, but that change over time. And so what's happening is you're inserting yourself into a political scene that's much more divided. Southern Italy is a bit like this, which is one of the other reasons beyond pure numbers that Robert Guiscard needs an entire lifetime to conquer much of it. But Ireland's perhaps even more acute. And so what you're doing is you're not able to just move over, get rid of one guy, and establish yourself fully. They establish a kind of loose overlordship relatively swiftly over much of the island, but the reality of their control is much more limited. And so what we're seeing there, as you say, is there's this chap Strongbow, Richard of Strigiol, to give his kind of proper name, who's originally of a Cambro-Norman dynasty, if we can perhaps even be more precise yet. He's of the Marcher Lords, so the Normans who've been busy carving up Wales. And again, Wales is a project that isn't kind of completed till the later Middle Ages, the conquest, for again, very similar reasons. Welsh politics is much more localized. Welsh geography doesn't make it easy to knock people out. So a good kind of half of Wales is under Norman control from about the 1090s onwards, sometimes more, sometimes slightly less, but rarely, much less than half to a third, is under external Norman English control. And these are the so-called Marcher Lords who control much of these lands, who often speak Welsh, kind of know local customs, but are also very battle-hardened, because this is the main threat and frontier for the Normans in England. It's where they can be attacked. And the Welsh, because they're politically divided means that, frankly, you can dominate one group or one part, but it doesn't get rid of the other. So there's a regular threat to them there. And it's no accident that it's out of this groups that conquest of Ireland ends up coming, because they're nearest geographically, they're already in touch with Ireland, but also they're the experts. If you're looking for any Normans left in England long after 1066 who know how to conquer, who know how to deal with hostile territory, it's them, because, the ones in Kent or place like that, they're comfortable and are kind of getting big and fat and, resting on their laurels. But the Marcher lords are something quite different. They're much more independent. They're the real exports. And so that's where Strongbow's coming out of. And he's going over there initially, classic Norman way, a bit like southern Italy, as a mercenary. So the King of Leinster has been ousted, and he's looking for allies. And the natural place to look is across the Irish Sea. So Leinster's in and around kind of Dublin, that kind of area. And he's been ousted by the new High King, who's from Munster out in, not Munster, who's from Connacht, out to the west. And he's come over and replaced him and kind of ousted him with another family member. It's common in Irish politics, but he wants to get back in. And so he's interested in getting support, interested in trying to interest maybe Henry II of England. Henry's got bigger fish to fry, but says, yeah, go ahead, recruit some of my men. I'm happy kind of for you to do that. And so he's able to get this chap who's later known as Strongbow as one of those to come over. Who comes over, and they win some very spectacular battles, a bit kind of like Normans again in southern Italy, gets them a toehold, and then best of all, then they marry into that dynasty that brought them over. And when their guest dies, Richard says, well, I'm now heir, and inserts himself into
Of course.
the dynasty there, and starts taking over. And that's kind of where it begins. But it means, therefore, that their strongest control is around those territories of Leinster and what then becomes Meath. So those areas immediately around kind of Dublin, and Dublin as a linchpin, as a port that has long-standing contacts with England. And there's a kind of a long-term effect to this in terms of, modern English usages that, many of your listeners will be acquainted with, like, within the Pale. The Pale is actually originally slightly later, but a designation for effectively those areas of Ireland, which within the Pale means the kind of the very anglicized parts of Ireland, those that culturally are made to conform with those incomers. And that kind of long-term, effect is creation of that kind of buffer, because that's where their control is then very strong, is established fairly strongly quite early. But then beyond that, sometimes they have quite wide-ranging geographical control, but the depth of it is often questionable, and at moments of weakness, they can lose much of that kind of land and control. Again, very much kind of like what we see in Wales.
Is Henry II a Norman, or is that completely just not relevant anymore by his time?
That is an excellent question. I would say from a kind of perhaps a purely analytical perspective, as a kind of speaking as an academic, heuristically, I think there can be a value to saying he's Norman, because he still has attitudes that he wouldn't have had otherwise. He is francophone. He is, the traditional monarchs of England don't speak French. They don't behave in ways he did. They don't listen to French literature. They don't ask to be buried at Fontevraud, which admittedly isn't in Normandy, but it's a long, long way from England. This is in the crucial other thing with him is the family's sometimes known as the Plantagenets or the Angevins. He's from Anjou, who are the old enemies of the Normans, but they've teamed up in a sense, which is partly why his domains are so large. So he's definitely, in that sense, I would say, continental in terms of at heart. That's where he is buried. His most powerful domains are in England. But that's not where he's buried. That's not where his family's buried. That's not where his son Richard Lionheart spends most of his reign. So I think there's a value to saying, culturally speaking, he is effectively Norman, or you might say more accurately, in fact, Angevin Norman, in terms of his mother is of the Norman family and his father is from Anjou, i.e. Angevin. But he certainly, in terms of that, is culturally of that world. But yes, his political entity is England. Would he have seen himself as being a fellow countryman of Roger I of Sicily, the first Sicilian king? Is, I think, one of those great historical known unknowns. I'd love to have got them together. They'd have been aware of an element of affinity. I think they'd have both been aware that they could trace their line back to Normandy. But that alone doesn't make them the same. I mean, I guess it's the same questions you could ask about how important or not are links of the old so-called Commonwealth. You will find
Yes.
some New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, Brits who feel that's a very strong and meaningful identity, and you'll find plenty of others who see it as completely meaningless and everything in between the two. But, one thing I
Yes.
certainly can say as somebody who happens to originally be Canadian is you're a darn sight more likely to get Marmite in a Canadian supermarket than you are in an American one. So, there are some of these things. And so I wonder if
Yes.
that analogy,
Yes.
if I may be stretching things here, but almost works for this, that, you'd be a darn sight more likely to get that kind of Marmite sharing between, Roger and William, Roger and, Henry II, than many other European monarchs. So there would have been an awareness of certain things they shared, even if there was much else that they did not have in common.
Fascinating. So, I mean, it always seems to me that the Normans are kind of victims of their own success at the end. They just become all of the different nations of Europe. I mean, would that be fair to say? They sort of just
I
disappear
think
into the general population. I don't know.
Yes, I think so. And I think one of the most important lessons actually that came out of a book I mentioned earlier, but Rob Bartlett's book on the making of Europe, of which I think the Normans are kind of an essential chapter. He doesn't push the Norman angle because he's interested in that big picture. But one of the things that he rightly points out is that Europe between kind of 900 and about, and for his sake, he goes all the way to 1350, but becomes much more similar, objectively speaking, economic structures, cultural assumptions, and so on. But almost counterintuitively, this period also sees a rise of xenophobia and of things we could even potentially now call racism. And that may sound counterintuitive, but it actually makes perfect sense. The more we're similar, the more difference comes to matter more. And that's why, people who predicted in the 1980s and 1990s that globalization is going to end ethnic difference were, sociologically speaking, completely wrong. Because actually, the more people are objectively similar and in touch with one another, the more small difference can matter a great deal. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And I think that's what the Normans kind of exemplify. The more everyone becomes Norman, being Norman doesn't matter. So what matters is what's different between us.
So, final thoughts. What do we still have from the Normans today? I'm thinking cathedrals and churches. What are the things that are sort of left over from the Normans?
So I think if we're trying to think of modern legacies of them, perhaps the most crucial ones I'd see lying in kind of two areas. One is that kind of cultural legacy through the British Isles that, we end up with a Norman elite we've not had time to touch on even in Scotland without conquest. So we end up with large parts of Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and pretty much all of England entering a European mainstream and becoming part of the kind of ancien regime aristocracy that up until about the 19th century, aristocrats across Europe see themselves as having much more in common with one another than any kind of commoner and would be offended with any suggestion to the contrary. So we're seeing that, and that can be manifested in various ways, including castles, traditions of knighthood, and so on. But I think that's a much bigger movement. It's also manifested, you've noted, in Romanesque architecture, new types of church building and things like that, that again, we start seeing churches built in all these places that are recognizably not identical to, but familiar and similar to what we see in Paris, in Germany, in northern Italy. So that's, I think, one of the crucial ones, and that's where we see it most in the British Isles. The other one I'd say that's really crucial is their impact actually on southern Italy, because the fact that southern Italy ends up becoming majority Italianate. So there's a lot of Greek being spoken in this period, actually in southern Italy, as a native language. There have been Greek colonies since the ancient world. People in southern Italy don't speak Greek anymore. That's not coincidence. They're not Orthodox Christians, at least traditionally. They're Catholic Christians. That's because the Normans pull them decisively into Western Europe. And crucially in terms of this as well, it includes Sicily. Sicily is, geographically speaking, nearer to North Africa than to Rome. There is no particular reason why it should innately be Christian or Catholic rather than Muslim. And the fact that it is happenstance. There are other islands like Malta that traditionally, are more divided or that face towards and remained largely Islamic. So the fact that those things, parts that, you or I just assume are Europe, it's actually somewhat arbitrary because Europe, where does Europe become Asia? It's a line in the sand in terms of, Russia or places like that. These things are cultural divisions as well as geographical. And so the fact that particularly Sicily, but also even parts of southern Italy aren't ending up becoming either Greek or effectively North African and part of that orbit culturally is substantially because the Normans create a political entity that draws them into Europe and then keeps them there in a lasting manner.
Fascinating. Any final thoughts?
I don't think really beyond that. I mean, I'll say I think the thing with the Normans that I find so fascinating is precisely the fact that they are this force that is so important, that is so everywhere, and that they feel like a flash in the pan. And as I say, I think a lot of that really is because of the way they, in a sense, have become from one story to many, and also then the way we study the past, because we have been created and still think within blocks that are modern nation states that are relatively young, really, creations of the 19th century. Not that some of these, France and England, notably have longer histories, but the fact that we see these as identities that transcend class and things like that, the way we think of these is deeply, deeply influenced by the 19th century and by assumptions that, British history or English history is a meaningful designation. And sometimes it is, but often it isn't historically, because before a certain point, these things aren't nearly as meaningful as they are now. And I think the Normans are a nice illustration of that, because nobody really owns them. And so as a result of that, everybody's also a nobodies, and they all too easily get neglected. But, hopefully, by a tapestry coming over, nice opportunity to kind of remind ourselves of that. And I think in a perhaps post-Brexit era where people have been wanting to push at arm's length traditions that see us as part of Europe or that connect us to Europe, a reminder that that's actually an essential part of our, nation's DNA, not only in a literal DNA sense, but more importantly in terms of how the state has been created, and that for better or worse, England and Britain wouldn't be anything like it is nowadays without the Normans.
We've done an hour on the Normans, and we've barely spoken about the Norman conquest of England, which is good, because this is going to be sort of beyond the Norman conquest episode. But was the Bayeux Tapestry made in what is now England? Is it coming home?
Well, that is the million-pound question. We would love to have direct archaeology, which would be possible these days, potentially on the tapestry, to see if the sheep that went into it were English. But the available evidence overwhelmingly points to it being produced in or around Canterbury and Kent. The manuscript illumination evidence and so on. There are outliers there, because the Bayeux Tapestry is such a wonderful source. You'll always find some nutter conspiracy theorist. I don't know a sensible historian who's worked on it who doesn't think it is fundamentally conceived and executed in Kent. And that makes perfect sense, because who is the Earl of Kent but Odo of Bayeux? It also explains how this thing gets to Kent, and it brings everything together. So no, it definitely is coming home, or, well, in a qualified manner. I mean, it would be really coming home if we were going to probably St. Augustine's in Canterbury is our best bet. That would be, the Bayeux Tapestry coming home. But London's the next best thing, and I would certainly urge all your listeners in the UK, go and see it. This is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see the Bayeux Tapestry on our shores, to see them in the country whose conquest it commemorates. So to do it. There's no excuse not to.
There we go, folks. You heard it here first. Bayeux Tapestry, made in Kent, coming to the British Museum this year. Go and see it. Buy Levi Roach's books. Absolutely brilliant. Ethelred the Unready. He's one on the Normans, and you've got a couple of other ones as well. There we are, Normans. He's putting it on screen. And yeah, I hope we can speak again in the future. This has been an absolutely brilliant conversation. Thank you for talking to me, and good night, everybody.
Thank you for having me on.